Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most misunderstood and, let's be honest, sensationalized texts in all of history, the Book of Revelation. So I want you to forget everything you think you know, because we are about to peel back centuries of misinterpretation to get at its original and, I think, much more powerful message.
You know, for most people, that question immediately brings to mind these really vivid images. You've got apocalyptic horsemen, global catastrophes, and basically a detailed play-by-play for the end of the world. And this view, it's been cemented in our culture by centuries of art, blockbuster movies, and best-selling novels.
But what if that entire framework is just wrong? What if it's all built on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if we've been trying to read a first-century letter, a letter of political and spiritual resistance, as if it's a 21st century blueprint for the future? Realizing that difference, well, it changes absolutely everything about how we read this book.
And the source of all this confusion? It starts with the very first word. The book's Greek title, Apocalypsis, doesn't mean cataclysm or end of the world. It literally just means an unveiling or a revelation. So right from the get-go, the book tells us it isn't about predicting the distant future. It's about revealing a really urgent truth to its original audience.
Okay, so to really get this, we have to do a little bit of what you might call historical empathy. We need to put on our first century hats and stop seeing this as a message that was mailed across time to us. We need to start seeing it for what it actually claims to be, a message sent to them.
The author, a man named John of Patmos, he's not exactly subtle about his timeline. He opens his work by stating, not once but twice, that the events he's describing are going to happen very soon and that the time is near. In the context of ancient writing, that's a blinking red light for immediate relevance. We're talking about a matter of years, folks, not millennia.
And on top of that, this isn't some generic broadcast to the entire planet. The text is very specifically structured as a circular letter addressed to 7 real historical communities in what is now modern-day Turkey. We're talking about Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and so on. These were actual communities that John knew, and they were facing very specific, very tangible problems, like, intense persecution under the Roman Empire.
So this really presents us with 2 completely different ways of looking at it. Are we reading some kind of cryptic forecast of our own future, or are we reading a coded letter of encouragement that was meant to give hope to its very first audience? I mean, the evidence inside the text itself points overwhelmingly to that second option.
All right, so Chapter 1 kicks off with this incredibly dramatic, almost psychedelic vision of a figure who's identified as one like a son of man. And trust me, understanding who this figure is, that is the key that unlocks the rest of the book's symbolic language. Now, that title, Son of Man, it was not chosen at random. This was actually Jesus' preferred title for himself all throughout the Gospels. He used it way more often than Son of God. So for that early Jewish Christian audience, this title was absolutely packed with meaning, and it would have immediately grabbed their attention.
Now, the description of this figure, it's pretty wild, right? A head of white wool, fiery eyes, a sword coming out of his mouth. It sounds bizarre to us, but to a first-century reader who was steeped in Jewish scripture, it was like a tapestry of familiar references. Every single element you see here is drawn directly from descriptions of divine beings in the books of Daniel, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. It's all part of a tradition that scholars call Jewish temple mysticism. But here's the thing. For centuries, even for top biblical scholars, the precise meaning of this title was kind of a mystery. Yeah, it shows up in the book of Daniel, but the full character of this figure was, well, it was elusive. Was he just a divine being, a messianic title, or something else entirely? Well, the answer, it turns out, was hiding in plain sight, not in a book that made it into the final version of the Bible, but in another ancient Jewish text that was incredibly popular and influential around the time of Jesus and the early church. And this is where the historical context gets really fascinating. The Book of 1 Enoch, especially a section called the Parables, was widely read by Jews in the first century. And while most groups don't consider it scripture today, its ideas were a huge part of the intellectual and theological world of the New Testament writers. It was part of the air they breathed.
So what do we find in 1 Enoch? Well, we basically get a detailed job description for the Son of Man. He's described as this pre-existent divine being who sits with God, and he's been chosen for a very specific task, to be the agent of God's judgment against the wicked kings and the powerful people of the world.
Now pay close attention to this specific line from Enoch. The Son of Man isn't some warrior with a physical weapon. No, his power to execute judgment comes from the word of his mouth, which will slay all the sinners. This is a really potent metaphor for supreme judicial authority.
Okay, now let's jump back to the description in Revelation. When you read this verse right after reading Enoch, the connection is, it's undeniable. That seemingly bizarre, almost grotesque image of a sword coming out of a mouth, it's not literal at all.
What John is doing here is using a powerful shared symbol. He's tapping into a well-known concept from a popular book to tell his audience, hey, this figure, Jesus, he is the Son of Man you've all read about in Enoch. He's the one who holds the ultimate authority, and he is going to execute divine judgment on your oppressors, the Roman Empire, not with an army, but with the unstoppable power of God's spoken decree.
So, let's circle back. If Revelation isn't a doomsday calendar full of predictions about 21st century politics, then what is it? What's its actual purpose? Why go to all the trouble of using this elaborate coded language?
The reason for all the code was, frankly, survival. Writing a direct, critical pamphlet against Rome would have been a death sentence, plain and simple. So instead, John uses the symbolic language of apocalypse, of unveiling, to reveal a much deeper truth about how the world really works. He's using imagery from Daniel, from Ezekiel, from Enoch, to critique the earthly empire of Rome and to assure his readers of a heavenly reality where God is the one who's ultimately in control.
And this reveals the author's whole strategy. First, he acknowledges the very real suffering that these communities were going through. He validates their struggle. Then, he reframes that suffering inside this grand, cosmic story using symbols they would all immediately recognize. And finally, he delivers the core message: don't give up. The power of Rome might seem absolute right now, but the true authority, the real power, belongs to the Son of Man.
When you get right down to it, Revelation is a profound work of theological and political resistance. It is a pastoral letter written to build resilience and instill hope in people who are facing an overwhelming, oppressive power. It was never a book meant to scare future generations, but to comfort its very first readers with the promise that, in the end, justice will prevail.
And this way of rereading Revelation, it really challenges us to become better historical detectives. It forces us to ask a really critical question. When we take an ancient document and strip it of its original context, its audience, and its literary world, are we truly understanding it? Or are we just turning it into a mirror for our own modern anxieties and expectations?